pagan material, and when Christianity became viable, the other pagans picked up Christian material. Every one of these dying, rising gods is given an excruciating death, but it just doesn't seem to be they don't seem to have been crucified. Jesus is about the only one that's been crucified. And the crucifix being the cross, it was originally a T. It might have been made into a cross to fit all kinds of solar symbolism. I'm not saying that that's not the case. The cross as a solar symbol is quite ancient, and certainly that was co-opted into the idea.
But the point is that we shouldn't always assume when there's some sort of parallel or syncretism going on that it was always the other tradition informing Christianity, that this can go both ways. Yeah,
a great example of that is the nativity story of Krishna in an epic written in the medieval period. It parallels the combined nativity stories are both Luke and Matthew. So it's unlikely that they got it from Krishna, because they would have kept the whole myth, which included both the trek to a city to pay taxes and the slaughter of the innocents and all these other things, instead of dividing up into two. So it's more likely that in that case, Krishna, who was obviously a deity long before Jesus was, in later years they picked up the Christian nativity story.
But where did the Christians originally get the nativity story? And Joseph has a theory for that too. Joseph says that the birth sequence is completely astrological. He makes a claim that the star in the east is Sirius. He says that on December 24th, Sirius aligns with the three brightest stars in Orion's belt. And these three bright stars in ancient times were called the Three Kings. So there's the Magi. And so that Orion's belt and Sirius will all point to the place of the sunrise on December 25th, and that's why the Three Kings follow the star in the east. Then getting even deeper into this astrological symbolism, he says as the days shorten approaching the winter solstice, that the solstice now comes to represent the death of the sun as the sun eventually reaches its lowest point in the sky. But right before the winter solstice, he says a curious thing happens. The sun stops moving south, at least perceivably, for about 3 days. During this 3-day pause, the sun resides in the vicinity of the constellation called the Southern Cross. And then Joseph says, after this time on December 25th, the sun moves 1 degree, this time north, foreshadowing longer days, warmth, and spring. And thus it was said that the sun died on the cross, was dead for 3 days, only to be resurrected or born again. But you pointed out in your Skeptic Magazine article, after talking to real astronomers about this, that there are several inaccuracies here. First of all, Sirius doesn't really line up with Orion's belt, and that in historical times, the sun has never really been in the Southern Cross. In fact, the Southern Cross is barely even visible in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, it's the Southern Cross, I think, might have been just visible in certain areas of the Northern Hemisphere, mostly not. But let's start with the Three Kings. If you look at the nativity stories in the New Testament, you'll find there's 2 of them. And you know the nativity, that's the subject of Christmas pageants and such, combines Luke's story and Matthew's story. But if you take them separately, you find they disagree on every particular.
Right, the traditional Christmas story that we are aware of from...
Yeah, it's a mix of the 2.
Yeah.
So there is, in Matthew's story, there's no Roman census, no trek from Galilee to Bethlehem, no being born in a stable, nothing like that. No story of the wise men coming in Luke. And in the story of Matthew, it doesn't say there were 3 kings or even 3 wise men. It just says Magi came from the east, saying that we followed the star. And there's been all kinds of people trying to figure out what the star was. It's an alignment of 2 planets in a given constellation, and they all come up with different ones, and nothing quite fits. Also, the people try to say, oh, there was a nova at that time, but there's no nova being reported. And people did observe the skies in those days. But basically, the idea of a star rising has to do with a king being born. And the Matthean account is that Magi came from the east, which would be the Parthian Empire. This is a political myth. Wise men come from the Parthian Empire and hail Jesus as a king. The Parthians, at a time when the Romans were having a civil war, invaded the east. This is when the war was between people following Cassius and Brutus and on one side and Mark Antony on the other. And they set up the last Maccabean king, a fellow by the name of Aristobulus, I believe. They set him back on the throne, but the Romans came in, drove the Parthians back out, and executed the last of the Maccabeans. So it's a political statement. Parthians are coming to recognize this guy as the king. He's the guy who's going to throw out the Romans. That's the implication there. And the only reason we think of them as three is because there are three gifts. And the gifts are interesting because they're also a political myth. When the Queen of Sheba visits Solomon in the Old Testament, she brings him all kinds of great gifts. And where does she come from? She comes from the southern end of the Red Sea, which is where frankincense and myrrh come from. And that's where they are brought up. In fact, they're brought up on a trade route called the incense route. So they bring gifts that would be brought by the Queen of Sheba to Solomon: frankincense, myrrh, and of course gold. And so there's no three kings. They're not kings in the first place, and there's not three of them. This is all extra biblical elaboration that has come out of the traditions that grew up around the Nativity.
Which this should really give us a clue as to what his methods really are. Peter Joseph just seems to be taking a bunch of scattered ideas and trying to connect the dots. He doesn't even seem to be really consulting the biblical texts themselves. This is also seen in his alleging that the 12 disciples, that they number in 12 because there are 12 signs of the zodiac.
And there's also 12 tribes of Israel. Now, whether the tribes of Israel themselves had a zodiacal reference, I kind of doubt, because it probably is based on 12 months of the year that they